Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, coastal communities rely on jobs in the transportation industry, especially in shipping. During the last election campaign, the Liberal Party promised not to change the Coastal Trade Act. Yet this bill allows foreign registered vessels to compete unfairly with Canadian ship owners. We're requesting that Canadian registered vessels continue to have preferential access to government contracts, carriage of goods by container, and repositioning of empty containers. In addition, this government did not consult the stakeholders affected by this measure. So why is the government going back on its word and now opening the door to unfair competition by foreign registered vessels?
The Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question, and I can assure the honourable colleague that anything that this government does is taking into account Canadians, and we surely don't intend to have any change affect Canadians in a detrimental way. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we do operate in a global economy, in a global market space, which is why we shouldn't be very protectionist. We should actually work with foreign investors to actually increase our economy and benefit all Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Parry Sound Muskoka.
I'd like to ask the Honourable Member, we've had a lot of debate in this House already on this bill, which seems to be, and in fact manifestly is, an omnibus bill, amending 13 different pieces of legislation. At the same time, the much vaunted expression to the Canadian people was that this was going to solve a lot of passenger issues, that this was going to be the passenger Bill of Rights, and yet there's very little in the bill that is about passengers. So I'm wondering whether the Honourable Member could give his perspective and why he's supporting this piece of legislation when it doesn't do what it said it's going to do and has all this impact on 13 other pieces of legislation.
The Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. I find it quite curious to have that charge, knowing as the previous government was notorious for using omnibus bills. Now, if you look at what we're putting forward, it's all dealing with one piece of legislation. 90% of it's dealing with one piece of legislation. So, having said that, I'm quite confident that this bill is going to help Canadians, and especially with the aspect of air passenger rights. We're 15 years behind Europe and 15 years behind the United States and 12 years behind Europe. So it's about time we put something forward that Canadians can rely on. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Alors, la députée de Saint-Boniface, Saint-Vital.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Boniface, Saint-Vital.
The Honourable Member for his very comprehensive speech. I know he's worked very hard on Transportation Committee for the last couple of years, and it certainly is showing. Could the Honourable Member comment on how this bill affects the overall strategic plan with respect to the Minister's comments on Transportation 2030?
Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. The approach is looking forward to 2030, and the approach has been to look at the entire transportation system holistically. As it is quite vast, it's quite intricate, and I applaud the Minister for the work that he's done and all the consultations that he's taken with stakeholders and Canadians. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Vancouver, Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, listening to a debate where the Conservatives accuse the Liberals of introducing omnibus bills is a little bit rich because, of course, the previous government, the Harper government, introduced omnibus bills to such an extent that Canadians became actually quite engaged in a rage about it. But that's no excuse, nor does it excuse the current government from doing the same thing, and they are doing that here. The Liberals stood in this House along with the New Democrats and criticized the previous government for introducing omnibus bills, and here they introduce a bill in one bill that amends 13 different acts and is by every single measure an omnibus bill. But my question is about Canadians, not about what we're doing in this House here. and that is, I'd like the member to explain why his Liberal colleagues voted against an NDP amendment that would have, among other things, required airlines to reimburse passengers for the full price of a ticket when a flight is cancelled. It would seem to me that that would be a very logical and reasonable request of airlines. Why did the Liberals not support that NDP amendment?
Good question.
Honourable member for Mississauga Streetsville.
Thank you for the question. I do apologize I wasn't here in the House when the government was here, but just speaking to the first part of your question, you can't compartmentalize such a vast transportation system. And when this is dealing 90% with one act, I don't see how this is omnibus. To the second part of your question, we work quite collaboratively in the committee, and specific amendments, perhaps if rejected, could be due to duplication. It could be for a various number of reasons, but there's no malice there. We actually work really well together. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Huron-Bruce.
I think when David Emerson did the review of the Act many years ago and put forward his report, vision for transportation in this country, obviously this bill falls well short of his vision. Specifically, though, the government on the Bill of Rights for passengers, they leave it to regulation. Virtually everything is left to regulation instead of putting it actually in the bill, in the law, so the Canadians know, Canadian members of Parliament know what they're voting on. Why did the government fail to put these penalties that would provide support to passengers in the Act instead of leaving it to the department to do by regulation?
Honourable member for Mississauga Streetsville.
Once again, I'd like to thank the new member of our committee for the question. This, quite frankly, just leaves a lot of flexibility. Going forward, everything will be stipulated in the legislation, but the important thing is to actually get the ball going now. As I said, we're playing catch-up with our counterparts in Europe and the United States. So once we get this in place, everything else will be stipulated in the legislation. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, as stated earlier, this government ran on a platform that they weren't going to be ramming through omnibus bills through this House. Mr. Speaker, they're putting 13 acts together in one bill, and they say that 90% of it is covered in one act. So why didn't they separate the one act and put forward that piece of legislation separately? When you look at what they're putting forward in this bill, they're talking about joint ventures between airlines, passenger bill of rights, protecting the marine industry through transportation, which they haven't done. This bill is jam-packed with so many different issues that need to be debated separately. So I asked the member, he pointed out that the Conservative government rammed through omnibus bills. They opposed them during the campaign, yet they're doing it themselves. So I'd like to hear from the member explain why this government is ramming through omnibus bills, and if he thinks it's, what is the threshold is the question I'd like to know. Is it 15 acts? Is it 20 acts? 25 acts? What is the threshold for this government in ramming through omnibus bills?
The honourable member for Mississauga Streetsville.
Thank you. I completely disagree. We're not ramming through anything. When you have such a vast, intricate system, you can't compartmentalize it. You need to look at it holistically. Otherwise, you'd be duplicating the work we're doing here, which doesn't make sense. Now, like I said, we're playing catch-up, especially when it comes to air passenger Bill of Rights. We're over a decade behind. So I think that speaks for itself. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you. Well, the honourable member is trying to justify an omnibus bill. This is a bill that deals with grain transportation, video recorder and voice recorders in trains, Coastal Trade Act, port infrastructure, joint ventures between airlines, passenger bill of rights. I mean, other than the common thread of transportation, these are all extremely separate and discrete areas of legislation that all warrant specific debate in this House. And so I really don't accept his defense of why this is a justified omnibus bill. But my question is about the coastal trade. We know that the previous government pursued negotiations with the European Union for CETA, and one of those concessions we gave European shippers is that they can actually have European flagged vessels ply internal Canadian waterways between Halifax and Montreal, and move empty containers and take loaded containers back and forth and dredge, and Canada got no reciprocal right to do so in internal European waterways. Can my honourable friend justify that?
The honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Thank you for the question. I don't think this is a matter of justification. There are nuances when you're dealing in a global market space, and this government will and has acted in the best interest of Canadians. Thank you.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate.